Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Agroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And today on the show, going to be doing something a little bit different. We are back for the new year. Very excited to be doing the show again a little bit more consistently now that the holidays are over. But today, going to do something different from what we did the other day, which is we're not going to actually be looking at some kind of critique sorry, I shouldn't say critique. That is what we are here to do. I just can't get my words together. But yeah, no, I'm not going to be reading a prompt and giving advice or anything like that. We're going to be doing a critique today. So our wonderful producer, Natalia Emmons, has found a critique my story excerpt post. I have not looked at it yet, so we're going to react to it live, and I'm going to give you my thoughts on it and a nice little play-by-play of what I think of this and what I think it could do better, or maybe it's perfect. I don't know. Again, I haven't seen it. But anyway, so we're going to be looking at this in just a second. As a reminder, if you're a fan of fantasy writing for barbarians and you have your own question, something you want me to critique, anything that you want to reach out about, please feel free to do that whenever you like. All you have to do is email us, fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. You can chat with us, hang with us in the Discord as well, linked in the show notes. Or you can leave a comment, of course, on the YouTube channel, whatever you like. But all right, let's just get into it then. And I'm very excited because I love doing critiques. They are a little nerve-wracking because it's a little trickier to do this stuff step by step, but I do enjoy it. So let's get into it. All right, so I have the critique excerpt right here. So this comes to us in the Fantasy Writers subreddit. It is from username LazyInitiative814. And let's see here. So they have chapter 1 of Snow Eater. They said this is a fantasy. It's 876 words. So I'm not going to do all 876 words because that would take quite a while. I'm just going to do a little bit of this, and I guess we'll just use discretion. Usually I kind of go by, about 100 to 300 words, something like that. So hopefully we'll still be able to give some positive, good feedback, or I guess I shouldn't say positive, but constructive feedback. Yes, that is the correct word. All right, and first of all, I will say Snow Eater. Oh, that's an interesting title. I don't think I've seen that before. I could kind of maybe see the cover. And I do see that they have just a first sentence here. Hi all, I'm looking for any critique of my draft. The first chapter is pasted below. Interesting that that's the first chapter, 876 words, is pretty short for a chapter 1 in terms of, a fantasy genre. Usually chapter 1s typically are at least 1,000, closer to 3,000 a lot of the time, but it depends on the story. So we actually don't know how many words the whole book is too. This is like 80,000 words. Maybe that makes more sense. I don't know. But yeah, that is curious. I will say that whenever you do these kinds of critiques, especially on the subreddits, but if you ever want to get critique from somebody, so an editor like myself, or a developmental kind of person, somebody, a beta reader, critique partner, whoever, it's really, really helpful to just give a bit more information. I understand that this is the context of a Reddit post, and so they might just be by abiding certain rules. I don't think, though, there are any rules, just giving us a little bit more info. So you don't have to give us like a full synopsis or anything like that, but just some kind of like, hey, this is the book, the name of the book, they did that, but how many words it is, maybe just some kind of vibe. Is this grim fantasy, dark fantasy? It's just something to kind of give us a frame of reference so we do less work. We don't have to do as much work in that first paragraph. Think of it like, and I know I've brought this up before, but think of it again as like if I walk into a bookstore, yeah, I could read the first page of something and not know anything about it, but usually I at least know like the section of the bookstore it is. So I'm like, okay, this is fantasy. Here are the books that it's next to, right? So maybe there are some dark fantasies next to it or some epic fantasy next to it. So that gives me a frame of reference. And then of course the cover. The cover tells me a lot. It gives me a vibe, right? If it looks like a V. Schwab book, for example, I might get a totally different impression. If it's, something that's a bit more of like a romantic-y cover, is going to be very specific. So that's just the sort of thing that helps you when you're in a bookstore put the frame of reference in mind before you start reading the first few words and you get a sense of what's to come. So anyway, let's get into this excerpt now. So I am going to read this. I'm going to do my best audible, narrator impression. I have done some of this stuff before, but I'm not going to be too weird about it. And I will say that if you want to follow along, I am, of course, going to link this in the show notes so you can read it for yourself as well, as long as, of course, the original poster, Lazy Initiative, leaves it live on the subreddit. So hopefully that will be the case. But all right, let's start. All right, here we go. Curson surveyed the dead. hundreds of them, if not thousands. It was rude to count. He had reached the end of one family line. He had started sweeping at the far end with his grandfather, whom they had only buried a few days ago. As he walked down the lines of generations, one family line quickly blended with many, one people stretching back generations, all laying in cold slumber, eyes closed and facing up at the sky. Curson turned around with his long broom and began making his way back down the adjacent line of bodies. The dead were often buried next to friends, as some family lines died out, or branched out so much that they ran out of blood relatives. In truth, whom one was buried next to said little about any relationship with them in life. It was just neater to bury them in straight rows. His long-handled broom allowed him to sweep the snow off the ice that embraced the dead, without doing them the disrespect of walking over them. He had volunteered for sweeping duty and did not regret it, despite the freezing temperatures. It wasn't as if he had anything better to be doing. Everyone was buried in their favorite clothes, but under 2 feet of ice. It was hard to judge the good cloth from the poor. Curson looked up to see a figure approaching in the distance through the white expanse, from the direction of the mountain. They wore all white fur like himself, but he could tell from their gait that it was his mother. Curson gave a sigh, the fog of his breath carried lazily away by the frigid breeze. She was still some way away, so he kept sweeping. He trod along the ice between rows of the dead, sweeping the powdery snow away from them and into the path between their ranks. One honored one's ancestors by keeping their bodies clear for the living to look upon. One also prevented the ancestors being dug up by bears or shat on by dogs too, when one could help it. He had heard that in the South, people burned their dead in some strange ritual to their sun god. Other stories held that they buried their loved ones in thawed soil, where they rotted as if they hadn't been buried at all. It all sounded barbaric to Curson here. Where people were civilized, they preserved their forebears in the ice. A few other sweepers were at work in the huge grave field, some accompanied by restless sled dogs, but they were all small shapes in the distance. Curson's mother was now only 100 paces or so away, but he looked down and minded his work. He didn't much feel like talking, and she would be here with another lesson, no doubt. He didn't hear her steps until she was some 5 paces away. He looked up. "What is it?" He frowned. "Oh, I do need a reason to check on my father and my son?" she asked. She was a short woman, her black hair fading to gray. "Grandfather has more need of being checked on than me," grumbled Curson. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked down the field in the direction of where grandfather lay under the ice. Mother gave a sigh and grabbed the front of his coat to brush the snow off it. "You know, your swaddling cloth might be thicker now, but you boys are all still babies sometimes." So that's where I'll stop there, and I would keep reading. I would have, if there was any point in this where I felt like I would have lost interest, let's say again in that hypothetical bookstore, I would keep going with this. I think that, let's start off with the positives. This is very efficiently done in terms of the prose, right? It's a little stiff, but it's working enough to build the atmosphere. We're talking about a scene where there's a lot of dead people. Of course, it's going to be a bit terse. And so I do think that the author here has a pretty good understanding of what the tone needs to be. And so that kept me going. And I think that, just kind of setting the scene too and giving us an immediate sort of sense of the personalities involved definitely helps engage us, right? So that first line, Curson surveyed the dead. It's a very short sentence. It's only 4 words, but it is enough for me to ask a very simple question that I need some kind of context for. What do you mean by dead? What are we talking about here? Because that could mean a million different things. Next sentence immediately pays it off. Hundreds of them, if not thousands, semicolon. It was rude to count. That answers the question. That tells me a lot of things. That this is, first of all, a very grave situation, no pun intended, but also just kind of this darkly ironic, it was rude to count. It gives me just enough of Curson, because here is a character who is in this horrific situation. You're surveying the dead, and you have this kind of pesky little thought of like, it's rude to count all of these people. That's kind of interesting because it's a bit subversive, It's not overdoing it. It's not hitting me in the face with a punch of like, oh my gosh, this book, you know. A lot of first lines tend to try to do that of like getting our attention. And then the problem is in the next line, it doesn't pay it off very well. It just feels like shock value for the sake of it. But this feels a bit more considered. And each sentence in this first paragraph, it's a long paragraph, is doing just enough to give me little morsels of information, right? So he's going through family lines. We get some information that his grandfather is part of this. There's a personal stake here. Him walking down the lines of generations, we're immediately getting like some little emotional tidbits of what he might be feeling without telling us straight up. And that's really well done. Now, I would say that as we go along this, I think that there are two things that stood out to me the most on the negative side. I'd say that there was almost a little bit too much distance, a little bit too much of being coy about what Kirsten is feeling. Now, that's not to say that we need it to be overly explicit, but I think one of the little cheat codes that we can have with this sort of thing is to be a little bit more forward with the prose and the lyricism. This is written in a way that is pretty stiff. It's a bit kind of like Sanderson, essentially. And what you want to maybe try to do is, in a few instances, make it a little bit more vivid. Give us a little bit more of that same subversion I was talking about, but instead of it being in this sort of, you know, the kind of like personality, the descriptions. I think the descriptions here could be making us feel more immersed in the scene. I want to feel the cold, right? Saying things like the word ice is fine, but just giving us something that really sets this icy area apart. You know, there are just a few things of like frigid breeze, you know, fog of breath, trotting along the ice. It's a little bit too plain for the kind of atmosphere I think the author is trying to go for. And so when you want that kind of vivid atmosphere, you want it to kind of feel like oppressive or, you know, dark and dank. You do need to maybe take a look at, okay, here are some spots where I could maybe, you know, use metaphor to kind of really get something across, really get across like what it's like to be in this place, like one person surrounded by dead bodies. There are all kinds of interesting metaphors you could do there. And another thing that metaphor work here could do, if you use it sparingly, you don't want to overdo it, but if you find the right ones, it can also give us more of a sense of what kind of fantasy this is. Again, we just know the title is Snow Eater. I don't have a frame of reference for what kind of fantasy this is. I get the sense that maybe it's like a dark fantasy. I don't really know. And that can be a problem because I do want to know early on what I'm in for. I don't want it to be too coy, right? It's a tough balance to strike. Now, I do think because the author does have this kind of efficient storytelling mode they're in, it's just enough to keep us going. But the other thing in the negative side that almost stopped me in my tracks was a little bit of the dialogue. I felt like the dialogue was a little bit stilted. You know, there's the first thing where he says, "What is it?" He frowned. First of all, I would not use frowned as a dialogue tag. So you'll notice that it's what is it, question mark, quotation mark, lowercase he frowned. So the implication is that he frowned, what is it? Now, I don't want to be a stickler for this sort of thing. I don't mind if people do like he spat as like a dialogue tag. I know some people find that really annoying. I don't necessarily. I think there's a line though. I think that if it's a more of an expressive sort of thing like frowned, that's a little bit too far in my opinion. I think you could just as easily say, what is it he said, frowning? You know, something kind of simple like that. And then when the mother kind of comes in with like, do I need a reason to check on my father and my son? This feels, I kind of hate to say it, it feels a little bit like, I don't mean this in the wrong way. And I'm so sorry, original poster. It does kind of feel like AI a little bit. This is the kind of like thing that an AI bot would probably put as dialogue because it's so basic, right? And I'm not saying that you used AI for this, but that could raise a red flag for an editor, an agent, whoever you submit this to, of like, some of this dialogue feels a little bit programmed. And it's because like, do I need a reason to check on, you know, my family member, whatever, is such overused phrase. And you have to be really careful with that stuff, especially when it follows what is it. So I'd be very, very careful with that. And then, yeah, I think like after that, I was a little bit like, I don't know. But he kept going in a way that I felt like, all right, I am still getting enough. Like there's this little line here, the mother gave a sigh and grabbed the front of his coat to brush the snow off it. That's nice. That's a nice little touch. It feels kind of like, I get a lot from the mother character and a very simple expressive thing like that. That's a great example of show, don't tell, right? Of like, the mother takes care of her son and cares about her son. Show that to me. That line shows that to me. So that's a really good, sort of thing. And then the dialogue, like your swaddling cloth might be thicker now, but you boys are all still babies sometimes. That's also a nice line. It tells me about the mother and what she chooses to say. That's something a mom would say. It's kind of cheeky, but it's also unique, right? Not every mother would say exactly that, but you can understand like there's a universality to that specificity in the sense that it's so specific and a little weird, but it speaks to a universal truth that rings true for a lot of people when it comes to motherhood, right? So those are my basic thoughts. I don't have too much to critique here. I think that, again, spicing up a little bit of your prose, making it a little bit more descriptive where you can really help. And I do like, it's a double-edged sword. I do like that you aren't overloading us with things like exposition or fancy fantasy names, right? You're not doing that, which I really, really appreciate. Keep doing that. Like don't mess with that. But I would say that we need a couple more tidbits that make this feel a little bit more like a fantasy if it's something that's going to come in later. For example, when you mention the sun god thing, because it's in the third paragraph and the first paragraph is really long, second paragraph is a little shorter, the third paragraph is pretty big. We don't get anything about like rituals and sun gods until the end of this third paragraph. It takes too long to get to the thing that feels a little bit more fantasy. And if you hadn't mentioned that at all, I probably would have been like, is this fantasy? I'd probably think this is a little bit closer to like an upmarket fiction. And I don't know if that's really the kind of thing that you're going for. It's tough. It's tough because I think anybody who's listening to this too might be like, well, you know what, John, I have read these fantasy novels where it feels like the first 3 pages don't feel like fantasy. It takes them forever to get to the fantasy stuff. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. There are exceptions to everything. Sometimes I read stuff and I'm just like, I get frustrated where I'm like, man, these authors make these like egregious mistakes or do these things that I think are so limiting, but people still click with them. And a lot of it is because certain authors can get away with things that you won't as a debut author. I'm assuming, this is a debut author. They did not give any of their credits. For all I know, they could have been writing for 10 years and published 10 novels or something, but I'm assuming it's a debut author if they're looking for critique on Reddit. But all that to say, I think that if you want to break rules, remember the adage, you got to master the rules first. And I think that you want to remove as many barriers to success as you can. And that's to say that a lot of the things I'm talking about, it's not like any of these one things would write off your entire draft, no pun intended, or in the sense that one mistake like that, or even if I wouldn't even call it a mistake. Again, it's more of like a barrier. It's something that could inhibit somebody from connecting with your work. And all you're trying to do is to reduce that as much as possible. You're not going to do it perfectly. And you are going to have agents who, sometimes they're just going to react to things like that. It's super arbitrary and you'll never know. You can't account for every single thing. But hopefully through critique, if this is what you're looking for, critique is just going to allow you to get a sense of how different people are reacting to things. And you should always take it with grains of salt. Everything that I'm saying, if it doesn't resonate, that's that, right? Sometimes you need to do what's right for you. I certainly have gotten plenty of feedback and critique that I've looked at and I've tried to implement, and I've said, you know what, I'm going to keep doing it my way. And maybe that means it's going to inhibit my work too much, but sometimes I have to make that stance because it's how I feel is right. But most of the time I get critique and I'm like, that's a good point. I could definitely implement that in some way and amp up my work a little bit. So overall, this is really strong. I would love to keep reading with it and see, how this progresses for the original poster. And I think that they're onto something kind of nice here. They have a nice, crisp writing style that could really serve them well. But that should probably do it then for this critique. I really didn't have too much besides that. And it doesn't look like there's anybody else who has commented on this yet, which is sad to see. But yeah, I will for sure reach out to the original poster, or our producer will, and let them know we did this. And hopefully this will be helpful for them if they can take a listen and get anything useful out of it. We sure hope that is the case. But for now, have a great rest of your weekend, listeners. If you're in a time zone where it's the weekend, I always forget how days of the week works in other countries and such. But anyway, Take it easy, everyone. Have a happy Friday. And we'll be back pretty soon, hopefully, for another episode of Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Take care, everyone.